Let me tell you about a place called Biglerville, a small farming town in the apple country of Adams County in south-central Pennsylvania, and about the coldest fall the people there ever watched a man refuse to give up. It was the year 1973. The first hard frost had already come down over the valley, and out past the last row of houses stood the old Hartley orchard, 40 acres of apple and pear trees that everybody in town had decided were dead. It was a hard autumn, and the trees looked like gray bones standing in gray grass. And on the morning this story turns on, there was a man out among them who would not leave. His name was Sal Greco, though nobody in Biglerville ever called him that. To the town, he was just old Sal, the immigrant who had pruned those trees for as long as anyone could remember. He was past 70 that year. He had come across the ocean as a young man from a mountain village most people there could not have found on a map. And he had spent nearly 40 years walking those 40 acres with a knife and a ladder. And now the trees stood bare and brown, and Sal stood among them with his hat in his hands. Now here is what you need to understand about that orchard. Old man Hartley, who had owned it, had died that spring. He went in his sleep in the month of March, and they buried him before the ground had fully thawed. He had no children, no wife left living, and no will that anyone could find. So the whole place, the house, and the barn, and those 40 acres of what looked like dead wood, fell to the Farmers' Trust Bank down on Main Street, because Hartley had borrowed against the land in the last 2 dry years, and never paid it back. The bank did what banks do. On a Monday morning, they sent a young man out with a hammer and a sheet of yellow paper, and he nailed a foreclosure notice to the orchard gate. A few days after that, 2 men in a truck drove out and pounded surveyors' stakes into the ground along the road. Little wooden stakes with orange ribbon tied to the tops, snapping in the wind. Everybody knew what the stakes meant. Come spring, a machine was going to drive out to the Hartley place and push every one of those trees over into a pile and burn them. And where the orchard had stood, they would build houses, or a lot for equipment, or nothing at all. The land was worth more empty than it was full of dead trees. And it was dead. That is what the whole town believed, and it was an easy thing to believe. 2 summers of drought had cracked the ground out there like a drop plate. The leaves had come in thin and yellow for 2 years running. And then, that last spring, on most of the trees, they had not come in at all. You could snap a small branch in your hand, and it would break dry and brown all the way through. No green anywhere in it. When 40 acres of orchard look like that, you do not argue with it. You cut it down. But old Sal did not believe it. And on a cold morning in the second week of that October, he put on his good coat. The dark one he only wore to church and to funerals. And he walked into the lobby of the Farmers' Trust Bank and asked to speak to whoever was in charge of the Hartley place. They gave him the young loan officer, a fellow named Raymond Dell, who could not have been more than 26 years old and who had a desk near the window. Sal sat down across from him and turned his hat in his hands, the way he did. And he made his ask in that slow, careful English he never quite lost the accent on. "Those trees," Sal said. "You are going to knock them down in the spring." "That's the plan, Mr. Greco," young Dell said, not unkindly. "There's nothing out there to save." "I'm sorry. Give me 1 season," Sal said. "1. Do not send the machine until next fall. Let me have the orchard through 1 growing season, and I will show you what is out there." Dell looked at him for a while. Then he asked the question everyone in town would ask before that year was out. "Mr. Greco," he said, "those trees are dead. What exactly do you think you're going to do with a dead orchard?" And Sal said, quiet as anything, "They are not dead." Now, picture how that landed. Word of it got around Biglerville by supper the same day, the way word did in a town that size. Old Sal, the foreigner, had gone to the bank and begged them to let him keep a burnt-out orchard, and he had sat there in his funeral coat and told a college boy that 40 acres of gray sticks were not dead. People laughed about it at the feed store. They laughed about it in the pews on Sunday. A man who had spent his whole life pruning other people's trees, too proud or too foolish to see that these ones were finished, asking to spend his last good year fussing over firewood. My own father shook his head about it at the kitchen table. "The old man's grieving," he said. "Hartley was about the only friend he had. He can't let go of the place, that's all. It's a sad thing, but you can't argue a dead tree back to life." That was the thing everybody agreed on. You cannot argue a dead tree back to life. And here is what you need to understand. They were right about one thing and wrong about everything else. because Sal was not planning to argue with those trees at all. He was planning to do something to them that not one person in that valley had a name for. Something he had carried in his 2 hands all the way across an ocean and had been waiting 50 years to need. Young Dell, to his credit, did not say no that day. He said he would have to ask the bank. But before Sal stood up to leave, he leaned across the desk and asked one more time, because he truly did not understand. "How can you tell me they're not dead," he said, "when anybody can see they are?" And Sal only smiled a little and put his hat back on and said, "You are looking at the wrong part of the tree. Here is something worth knowing. A fruit tree can lose every leaf, drop every branch tip to brown, and still not be dead. The living tissue you cannot see is a thin green layer called the cambium, sitting just under the bark. And below it, the roots may hold water and life for years after the top appears finished. What kills a tree for good is when that layer dries all the way through, root and trunk together. Until then, a tree that looks like a gray skeleton in a field can still be holding on, waiting for a reason to grow. Now here is the part that matters, the thing Sal had carried across the ocean. Let me tell you what he actually meant to do, because it has a name, even if nobody in Biglerville had ever heard it. The craft is called grafting. It is old, older than anyone living, older than the town and the bank and the whole valley. What it means, plainly, is this. You take a small living twig, cut from a tree that is healthy, and you join it onto the trunk or the roots of another tree, so that the two grow together into one. The little twig is called the scion. The old trunk and roots that take it in are called the rootstock. If you cut them right and bind them right, the two of them heal into a single living thing, and the old roots below push their water and their strength up into the new wood above, and the tree begins again. It is not a trick, and it is not a miracle. It is a joining. Farmers in the old country had been doing it for 1,000 years before anybody thought to try it in a valley like that one. Sal had learned it as a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, on a stony hillside in the village where he was born. His grandfather had taught him, standing behind him with his hands over the boy's hands, showing him how to hold the knife and where to make the cut so the two green layers would meet. In that village, every family kept its own apples and its own pears the same way, grafting the good wood forward year after year, because a single tree that bore sweet fruit was worth more than money, and the only way to keep it was to carry a cutting of it onto new roots before the old tree died. Sal used to say that his grandfather could take a wild seedling from the woods, a bitter thing that bore fruit fit only for pigs, and by the next spring have it growing the finest apple on the mountain, all from one twig and one clean cut. So when Sal looked at the Hartley orchard, he did not see 40 acres of firewood. He saw 40 acres of rootstock. He saw hundreds of old, deep, stubborn root systems that had survived 2 droughts underground while the tops went brown. And he believed down in his bones that if he could find enough living scion wood and join it to those roots, the orchard could be made to grow again from the ground up. But he needed living wood to graft with, and that was the first problem, because most of the trees on the place were too far gone. So all through that late fall and into the winter, Sal walked the orchard with his cracked leather notebook and his knife. And he did 2 things. The first thing he did was hunt for life. He would go up to a gray trunk and shave a little sliver of bark off with the tip of his knife, very gently. And he would bend down close and look. If underneath the bark there was a thin line of green, damp, and pale, then that tree still had its cambium, that living layer, and its roots were probably still good. If underneath there was only brown, dry all the way through, then that one was truly finished. He tested them one by one, hundreds of them. He would mark each trunk with a smear of white paint, a different mark for the ones that were alive underneath and the ones that were gone. And in his notebook he kept the count, row by row, in his small slanted hand. The second thing he did was find his scion wood. Down at the far edge of the field, past the last planted row, there was one wild apple tree that had seated itself along the fence years before, a scrubby, half-tangled thing that nobody had ever tended. And that tree, out there on its own where the drought had not hit it so hard, had leafed out green every one of those 2 bad summers. It was alive, thoroughly alive. Sal decided that tree would be his mother stock. When the winter deepened and the wood went dormant and asleep, he cut slim, healthy twigs from it, pencil thick and no longer than your hand, and he wrapped them in damp cloth and kept them cold, waiting for spring. Those twigs, from that one worthless wild tree, were going to be the life he carried into the rest. You could see him out there morning after morning through November and December, a small dark figure moving slow between the rows with his knife and his notebook, bending to each trunk. And here is the truth about how the town took it, because it was not kind. They decided the old man had lost his mind. It is one thing to grieve, people said. It is another to spend your whole winter out in the cold, cutting little marks into dead trees and talking to yourself and hauling twigs around like they were made of gold. Sam Whitfield, who ran the hardware store, told half the town that Sal had come in and bought up every last block of grafting wax and every roll of cloth binding tape on the shelf, and paid for it out of a coffee can of coins, and Sam had rung it up, shaking his head the whole time. 40 acres of dead trees, Sam said, and he's fixing to bandage every one of them. It's the saddest thing I ever saw. Nobody asked Sal what he was doing, and Sal, being who he was, did not offer to explain. He just kept walking the rows and keeping his count. Sometime around the middle of that winter, young Dell drove out from the bank with an answer. The bank had talked it over, and they had decided, mostly because it cost them nothing to wait, that they would give the old man his season. But there was a limit on it, and Dell made sure Sal understood. "You've got until the first hard frost next fall," he said, standing at the gate with his collar up against the wind. "If there's nothing growing out here by then, the machine comes. That's the deal. One season, Mr. Greco, and not a day more." Sal shook his hand on it, and then he went back to his trees, and the whole valley settled in to watch an old immigrant lose everything he had left, one dead tree at a time. Here is something worth knowing about that craft. In grafting, the single most important thing is that the living layer of the scion, that thin green cambium just under the bark, must line up and touch the same layer on the rootstock. That is the only place the two can knit together. If the cuts are clean, and those layers meet, and are bound tight and sealed from the air, the wound heals, and the two become one tree. If they miss each other by even a little, the graft dries out and dies. Everything depends on that one careful, hidden line of contact. Spring came late to Biglerville that year, and when it finally came, old Sal began the real work. Let me tell you how it went, because it did not go the way the storybooks would. It went hard. In the last week of March, when the sap in the rootstock began to rise and the wild tree twigs he had kept cold all winter were still asleep, which is exactly how you want it, Sal started grafting. He would go to a trunk he had marked as living, saw the dead top off clean, and split the fresh stump just so. Then he would take one of his little scion twigs, shave it down to a fine wedge with 3 good buds on it, and fit it into the cut so that the green layers met, the way his grandfather had shown him 50 years and an ocean away. He would bind the joint tight with strips of cloth, and then seal the whole wound over with warm grafting wax so no air and no water could get in. Then he would move to the next trunk and do it again, hundreds of times. His hands, which were old, split at the knuckles and bled into the wax, and he wrapped them in rags and kept going. And then, in the middle of April, the frost came back. It was a hard one, late and mean, the kind that should not come once the buds have started to move. It came in overnight, and in the morning the earliest grafts Sal had made, the ones that had just begun to swell and wake, were black. The tender new tissue had frozen right where the two woods were trying to knit, and it died. He walked the rows that morning and found that near half of everything he had done so far was ruined. Half a month of work, gone in a single cold night. Word of it went around, because a neighbor had seen him at the edge of the field that day, just standing there, looking at the blackened joints. And that neighbor, who was not a hard man, said it was a pitiful thing to see, the old fellow out there with his ruined trees, and he was sure that would be the end of it. Anybody would have quit. 70 years old, half your work dead, the whole town laughing, and a bank clock ticking down. Sal did not quit. He waited 2 days for the weather to settle, and then he went back out and started cutting again. He had kept extra scion wood, more than he thought he would need. Precisely because his grandfather had taught him that a season will always take back some of what you give it. He recut the frozen stumps below the dead joints, back to living wood, and he grafted them over a second time. He said later it was like burying half your children and getting up the next morning to plant a garden anyway, because the ones still living needed you. The frost was not the last of it. In May, a spring storm came through in the night. wind, and hard rain, and by morning it had torn the cloth wrappings loose from a whole row of grafts along the open side of the field where nothing broke the weather. The joints were exposed, some of them pulled half apart, drying in the wind. Sal spent 2 days out there in the mud, re-wrapping and resealing every one of them, on his knees in the wet ground. And then the deer found the orchard. New green shoots in a valley of dead wood are like a lit lamp to a deer. And one morning Sal came out to find that they had walked the eastern rows in the night and stripped the tender new growth off a dozen of his best grafts, right down to the wrapping. So the old man, who had almost no money, spent a week of evenings building a fence around the rows he cared about most. And what did he build it out of? The dead brush and the broken branches he had sawed off all those trees. He piled the dead wood high enough to turn the deer, and behind it, he guarded the living. Each setback, he rebuilt. That was the whole shape of that spring. Frost, then rebuild. Storm, then rebuild. Deer, then rebuild. And all the while the town watched from the road and out of the corners of its eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing out there yet that looked like it was working. Gray trunks with little bandaged sticks poking out of them. That was all anyone could see. Then, one afternoon in early June, a stranger stopped by. He drove a state car, and he turned out to be a man from the county extension office. The fellow whose job it was to advise farmers, and he had heard secondhand about the crazy old immigrant trying to save the Hartley orchard, and his curiosity got the better of him. He parked at the gate and walked the rows without saying much, bending to look close at the grafts, running his thumb over the wax seals. Sal followed him, waiting. The way you wait when a man is about to tell you that you are a fool. But the extension man straightened up and pushed his hat back, and what he said was, "Where'd you learn to do this?" Sal told him. From his grandfather, in the old country when he was a boy. The man nodded slowly. "I've only seen this done right one other time," he said. "Down south of here, years ago. Fellow saved a whole orchard off dead-looking rootstock, same as you're doing." Everybody said he was crazy too, right up until the trees came back. He looked down the rows again. "These joints are clean. Whether the roots hold, I can't tell you, but the work is right. Somebody who says you're wasting your time doesn't know what they're looking at." And that was the first time. In all those months, that stranger from the county was the first person besides Sal himself to stand in that orchard and say out loud that the old man was not crazy. It did not fix anything. It did not make the trees grow. But it seemed to matter more than food to him, because after that day, Sal committed everything he had left. He staked the whole season on the strongest of the eastern rows. He stopped sleeping up at the house and moved a cot and a lantern into the old barn so he could be out among the trees at first light and last light both, watering by hand from buckets, watching, waiting. And then, near the end of June, on one grafted stump in the second row, where 3 months before there had been nothing but a dead gray stub and a little wax-sealed wound, a single bud on the scion swelled and cracked open, and out of it came one small curled green leaf. Here is something worth knowing. The reason grafting works best in early spring is timing. The rootstock must be waking, its sap rising to feed the wound, while the scion is still dormant and asleep, so it does not try to leaf out before the joint has healed. The wood you graft with is cut in the cold of winter and kept cold on purpose to hold it back. Get that timing wrong, graft too late, or with wood that is already woken, and even a perfect cut will fail. Half the craft is the knife. The other half is knowing exactly when. Now here is the part this whole story has been building toward, and this is the part that matters. That one green leaf in the second row was only the beginning. Through July and into August, all up and down the eastern rows, the grafts that had taken began to wake. One by one, the little scion twigs pushed out leaves, and then shoots, and then whole small crowns of new growth, until the trunks that the whole town had called dead were carrying living green heads of leaves up toward the sun. From the road you could see it now. You could not miss it. Where in the spring there had been gray sticks and bandages, by the end of that summer there were rows of trees coming back to life, feeding on roots that had waited 2 long droughts underground for exactly this. The day young Dell drove out from the bank, it was late August, hot and still, and word had gotten around that something was happening at the Hartley place. So half the reason he came was probably just to see it for himself. He parked at the gate, under the yellow notice that was still nailed there, faded now by a summer of sun, and he walked out into the orchard, and he stopped. Sal came down the row to meet him, wiping his hands on a rag. For a while, neither man said anything. Del just stood there looking up at a trunk he had personally back in the winter, written down as dead. And now there were green leaves rustling over his head. "Mr. Greco," he finally said. And his voice was not the voice of a bank at all. Just a young man who had learned something. "I owe you an apology." Then he walked back to his car, and he took out a claw hammer. And he went down that row of stakes along the road. The surveyor's stakes with the orange ribbon that had stood there since the winter marking the orchard for the blade, and he pulled every single one of them out of the ground and threw them in the trunk of his car. He pulled the yellow notice off the gate too, folded it up, and put it in his pocket. The machine was not coming. There was too much alive out there now to knock down. And the town. Oh, the town. Let me tell you how fast it turned. The same people who had laughed at the old immigrant in his funeral coat now found reasons to drive slow past the Hartley place. They would pull over along the fence and stand there looking at the rows, and some of them would call out to Sal and ask him, a little sheepish, how in the world he had done it. Sam Whitfield from the hardware store, who had rung up all that grafting wax shaking his head, came out one Sunday and stood at the fence a long time. And then he said, loud enough for Sal to hear, "I'll be damned. I truly will be damned." Neighbors who had said the old man was crazy now told the story to strangers like they had believed in him all along. Sal let them look. He was a courteous man, and he answered every question that was asked him honestly. But he did not gloat, not once. And he did not stop working, because a grafted tree in its first summer is a long way from an orchard, and he knew it. The real ending came the next year. That first winter after, the town held its breath. And in the spring, the revived trees came through it strong. Their roots and their new crowns healed into one now and pushing hard. And then, in the last week of April, the orchard did the thing that no one, not even Sal, ever quite believes until he sees it. It bloomed. Those rows that had been dead gray bones 2 years before came out all in white and pink blossom. The whole eastern side of the field, and the bees came from every hive in the valley, and Biglerville came out to look at it the way people come out to look at something holy. And that summer, the trees set fruit, small at first and not many, because a young graft does not give you a harvest in its first bearing year. But there was fruit, real apples, hanging and swelling and turning color on wood that the bank had marked for burning. Let me tell you about the one that mattered most. Down in the second row, on the very first stump Sal had ever grafted, the one where that single green leaf had cracked open back in June of the season before, there hung, when the fruit came, one apple. Just one. That first year. On that particular branch. It was red on the sun side and green on the other, and it hung there from wood that had been gray and dead and slated for the fire. On a limb the old man had joined with his own 2 split and bleeding hands out of a twig cut from a worthless wild tree along the fence. On the morning Sal picked it, a few people from the town were standing at the fence, and they knew, watching him, that they were seeing something they would carry the rest of their lives. He reached up slow, and he turned that one apple in his fingers until the stem let go, and he held it in his palm and looked at it for a long, long time. He did not say anything for a while. And then he said the only thing about the whole business he ever really said out loud, the thing the people of Biglerville would carry with them for 50 years. A tree, he said, is never as dead as it looks. There is almost always one living thing left in it somewhere, down under the bark, down in the roots, waiting. And the only job you have, the only one, is to find that one living thing and give it a new place to grow. People are the same. Land is the same. You do not argue with what looks dead. You look closer, and you find the life that is still there, and you join yourself to it, and you wait. Then he handed the apple down to a child watching at the fence, and told the boy to eat it. Old Sal is gone now, many years gone, but the orchard is still there. It bears every fall, and no one in Biglerville who remembers him ever drives past it without thinking of the old man. Here is the last thing worth knowing. A single successful graft can carry a variety of fruit forward, unchanged, for hundreds of years. Every tree of a named apple is not grown from a seed but grafted, cutting from cutting, back and back in an unbroken line to one original tree that a person somewhere chose to save. When you eat such an apple, you are tasting wood a grower joined by hand long before you were born. That is how the old varieties survive. Not by seed, but by someone, in some hard season, deciding they were worth keeping alive.